Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session about non-financial misconduct from culture to conduct that we presented by Paddock Consulting. Just by way of introduction, for those that don't know who I am or at this moment in time, I'm Mavin. I'm the Learning and Development Manager here at the MGAA and delighted to welcome you, our members, to this session. Before I hand over to our presenter, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping points, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but nonetheless we'll cover. You'll find that you can't use your microphone and camera just yet. Please don't panic. We're turned off just so that we can prioritise the session and reduce any interruption and stretching of the bandwidth. We will turn these on for the Q&A, so you will have the opportunity to speak directly to Sunita today as well if you'd like to. Regarding the use of AI note-taking tools, we don't have permission of everyone in the session to use these, so we ask that you turn these off if you've got them on, or we will have to remove them from the session. Questions are welcomed and encouraged throughout the session. We will predominantly come to these at the end during Q&A, but feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function to submit these, and like I say, where necessary, I'll put them to Sunita during the session, but we'll mainly cover these at the end. This session is being recorded and we'll get a link out to you post-session together with our feedback survey, which we do ask if you've got a few minutes, please do share your feedback. It allows us to continue delivering fantastic content such as this session. And if you find that this session is supporting your learning and development, you can always add this to your CPD log. That's all from me. I'm going to hand over now to Sunita to get our session underway. Thank you.
Thanks, Manveen. Good afternoon, everyone. And this is great, isn't it? Because it's I'm the person either standing between you and your lunch or just after your lunch. So thank you, everyone, for joining. So what I'd like to do today is take a practical look at the non-financial misconduct and what it now means for not just MGAA firms, but firms in general, senior managers and boards. So this is an area where the language can become quite technical very quickly. So my aim is to keep everything quite grounded in real decisions, real governance, and what firms need to do. So it's really a practical session. And then we would welcome any questions where people, I'm sure you've seen the policy statement and you might have a few questions. Also, the session is not about creating a perfect theory of misconduct, because that's just going to be impossible. It's about helping firms make good judgment calls, join up with HR and the regulatory thinking properly. And as you all know, most of you, if you're compliance people, HR people, it's about the evidence of how the decisions were reached and when the facts are difficult. So let me start with the focus for today. I was going to say the slides do work. So by the end of the session, I want you to feel clearer and more confident in 4 areas. First, how the FCA now defines and approaches non-financial misconduct under the conduct rules, under fitness and propriety framework. Secondly, when non-financial misconduct may fall within senior managers and certified regime. That's including behaviours in the workplace and outside and on social media. Thirdly, the governance, escalation and decision-making expectations that are now going to be placed on firms, senior managers and ultimately boards. And the practical steps firms should take to manage this risk in a way that is consistent, but also proportionate and most importantly, defensible. So this is intended to be practical rather than academic, because I'm sure you've heard about this before the policy statement came out, the survey when it came out, and now this is about, you've got all this stuff and you've got a September the 1st deadline. So what do I want to give you? I want to give you something practical rather than more academic blurb. So I want you to leave the room feeling a little bit more confident about how to think through a real case, how to escalate it and who needs to be involved. So hopefully that's what this session will do for you all. So by way of introduction, I won't spend too much time on here. I've spent more than 20 years working in financial services regulation, mostly insurance, and I've done a lot of work around in the area of conduct and culture. So A lot of that work has involved helping firms navigate difficult people, governance issues, especially where the facts are quite sensitive and where the judgment calls are not quite as straightforward as you think they're going to be. And often the consequences can cut across HR, compliance, and senior management. So a significant part of my work has focused on kind of the bullying, harassment, inappropriate behaviour, and the link between those issues, and then building that link into senior manager certification regime, the conduct rules, and the fitness and propriety. So the bit I care about the most is helping firms move from theory into the practical piece. So in other words, what does the framework mean? And when does a real case, when it lands on someone's desk, what does that actually mean? So the lens for today, going to keep it really simple: good judgment, good governance, and clear evidence of how decisions are reached. So that's hopefully going to be the thread throughout the whole session. So with that in mind, let's turn to what really matters. So the reason this matters now, it's not that it hasn't always mattered, because it absolutely has. But, you know, most of us have been in the insurance industry a long time. So the reason this now matters is that the regulatory frame has shifted. So it's no longer viewed as just simply as a people issue. It's viewed much more clearly through the lens of conduct, governance, and accountability. And we've seen the regulators showing their teeth on all of those three lenses. The FCA has also clarified when serious behaviour may become a conduct rules issue and when it may affect fitness and propriety. So for non-bank firms, because the banking sector have had this in for a while, so for non-bank firms, which is a significant development because it makes the regulatory implications much harder to sidestep. So it's got to be at the front, and you've got until the 1st of September to do this. And so that implementation date is really, firms should be using this period to get ready. You know, what training, what policies need updating. At the very least, at this point in time, you should have some form of gap analysis or a plan of action. So on the first pillar, we've got conduct. Serious bullying, harassment, and violence, yes, violence, now fall within the conduct rules where there is sufficient work-related links. So remember at the beginning I said, in work, out of work. I've also experienced a few years back, actually it must have been about 5 to 10 years ago, when, you know, people out for a drinks on a Thursday night, somebody had had a bit too much to drink, was an SMF, and punched someone. So that's what I mean. You know, I kind of laughed a bit when I said violence. I don't mean punching someone at their desk for not doing their job properly, but these things happen because we're now bringing the social element into it too. Then secondly, you've got governance, boards and senior managers. They're expected to show clear escalation, joined up decision making and meaningful MI. So if your governance framework is operating well, you've got the work that's done at the bottom, you've got a committee, then you've got committee of the board, and then it goes to the board. So it's like that pyramid of information that flows all the way up. And then when it gets there, you might have the board ask some questions, which is absolutely feasible and the right thing that they should be doing. And then you might have a few things that you need to do coming downstream. And that downstream piece then focuses on our accountability. Managers will be judged by their reasonable steps. I've seen today, and I haven't had the opportunity to read it, but the FCA have issued something else around SMCR. And when I've read it, if you're interested, I'll let you know what I think. But it's about reasonable steps. A lot of firms don't have that reasonable steps framework. So when you are thinking about doing your gap analysis, and when you are thinking about updating your documentation, look at your reasonable steps framework, look at your SMF packs, look at what you will include. Who is the SMF that's going to take overall responsibility for this? And how is that going to feed into the reasonable steps framework? So it's not really just about the incident itself. It's about the quality of the firm's response. So it's worth briefly reminding ourselves how we got to this point in the first place. So how did we get here? So this high-level timeline is useful because it shows it's a broader policy debate to a more focused and operational set of changes. So September 23, the original consultation covered a much wider set of D&I proposals. And those of you who read it, you will have seen that there were lots of stuff on diversity and inclusion. And it wasn't just about non-financial misconduct. But by March 25, the FCA made clear that it was narrowing the path and taking forward the NFM proposal rather than the full package. Then brings us forward to July 25. The rule change was made so that non-bank firms, that's us guys in the insurance sector, move closer to the banking sector position on serious non-financial misconduct. And then fast forward a bit more, last year, December 25, final guidance came out in policy statement 25-23. So this gave firms a clearer examples and more decision support. So actually the policy statement was very good, and it gave some good examples and gave some practical kind of examples within that can be used. And I bet, you know, people with every intention went into the 1st of January saying, right, we'll have a plan for this, we'll get moving. And some of you may, or most of you may, or actually all of you might have had. You've got your gap analysis, you've got your plan, you know what you're updating. And by the time you get to the 1st of September, don't forget that board meetings don't happen in the month of August in most firms. So really, we're approaching the end of April. You've got May and June and some of July before the summer break hits. So it's not actually that much time. So the practical point is that it's not a debate anymore. That's done and dusted. We're now in the prep phase. So the question is no longer whether firms need a view. The question is whether that view is operational, proportionate, and evidence-based. So that takes us to one of the most important distinctions in this whole topic, the two different root tests. So this is important because the same case can raise both a conduct rules question and a fit and proper question, but the tests are not the same. Under COCON, the focus is on work-related misconduct. In non-bank firms, serious bullying, harassment and violence towards colleagues can now fall within scope where there is sufficient work-related link. Remember what I said? The social element. That's not to say that someone's big brother's going to be watching you when you're out on a Saturday night. This is the work-related link. Now we did a series of workshops last year with the LMA, IUA and LIBA, and somebody asked a really good question. I've got a mate at work, I've got lots of friends at work, and somebody's getting married, or somebody's got a 40th birthday party, or a 50th or a 60th. Does that count as a work-related link? Good question, isn't it? You have to wait for the answer. A case can be in scope if either the person responsible or the person subjected to the misconduct works in the financial services part of the business. So the private life itself is outside of the FCA's conduct rule powers. So the core question is whether the behaviour is linked to the performance of the role. So it's also important not to overread the change. The new rule does not mean that every discrimination or victimisation issue automatically falls within the COCON for the insurance sector firms. Fit is broader than that. It looks at, so any of you doing like these annual fit and proper tests, Fit looks at integrity, it looks at suitability. So misconduct may matter wherever it happens if it tells the firm something important about the person's fitness. So often private life conduct can be relevant where it creates a material risk of breaching regulatory standards if repeated, or where the conduct is serious enough to damage confidence. So that's things like social media may also matter if it shows threats or clear criminality, or a material risk of workplace misconduct. Some of you might remember quite a few years ago, and it was definitely before SMCR because it was an approved person, who used to dodge his fares coming in from somewhere quite remote, and he did this for months or years even. And then there was he got arrested by the British Transport Police or whatever it is, and the FCA, when they read about it, they actually said he was not a fit and proper person to be an approved person. And you might say, well, that's got nothing to do with his work. But actually, if you're sitting on a board and you're dodging fares, it says a lot about your integrity as an individual. So it's things like that that then come into play that you need to be mindful of. I'm not suggesting anyone is dodging their fares, by the way. So the practical point is very simple. So don't assume that an HR answer is you're done and dusted. It's the full regulatory answer. So that collaboration, compliance, HR, risk becomes really important. And that raises the obvious question, what does count as non-financial misconduct? So at the heart, this is about behaviour, not about profit, it's not about performance, it's about behaviour that undermines dignity, trust, integrity, or judgment. So some of these examples will be familiar to everyone in the room. So bullying, sustained intimidation, harassment, sexual harassment, abuse of your authority, retaliation against complainants or whistleblowers, violence, serious threats, and serious dishonesty. All of this includes misconduct. It can also include misconduct at market events, so during travel or in social settings that are linked to work. So what does move a case into the regulatory territory? Are the questions on the right, is there a work-related link? Does the conduct affect dignity or create an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment? Is this a pattern rather than a one-off poor interaction? Does the behaviour tell us something important about integrity, about judgment, about culture, leadership? And could it affect fitness or even certification or regulatory references or board oversight, even where the HR outcome is limited? So these issues are rarely whether the behaviour touched the P&L, even though we do know that there are incidents, and there have been incidents, where poor behaviour doesn't get appropriately logged, not as a conduct issue. Poor behaviour doesn't get reported. Poor behaviour leads to a compromise agreement. Poor behaviour leads to, here you go, mate, here's a payment. I know Fred, who works at an insurance company over the road. I'm sure you'll be all right there. We haven't logged anything, you'll be fine. That's totally against the SMCR regime, because the idea is that we stop that from happening. So this isn't just about the conduct and managing this non-financial misconduct within your respective firm. It's to stop it circulating the market, and it's to protect us as a market and to work collectively. So that leads naturally to the conduct rules question. What I would say here is start with the work-related link and then test the facts carefully. So remember what we talked about, all the things that fall under the non-financial misconduct bucket? Does any of that link to the work environment? Some cases will be more obviously in scope. So misconduct towards a colleague whilst travelling to a work meeting, misconduct towards a client while representing the firm, misconduct at a firm's organised social event. And, we are seeing in firms that increasing number of reports post-Christmas. Or is it behaviour in work chats? Teams, when people think, I won't send an email, I'll put something on Teams chat instead because no one will know about that. Guess what? We've done investigations, and all of that is retrievable. So any other channels that are linked to your role. So these examples, pretty much straightforward. Then you've got this grey area. And this is where firms need to make some judgments. So it's not about a checklist. It's not about saying, here's the behaviours. Does it relate to work? Yes or no? Unfortunately, it's not as black and white as that. So let's take drinks that continue after a formal work event, a team social where junior staff feel they need to attend, messages on personal apps where the content and the participants are clearly work connected, cases where the facts are mixed and the work link becomes quite arguable. So at what point does it become a work link? You've been to a work event, you then move on somewhere else with a group of work people to go and have a few more drinks. Is it a work-related event or not? This is where your judgment is going to matter, and this is where your judgment calls become harder and harder. And then there are matters that are usually completely outside of COCON. So purely private or domestic conduct with no work connection at all. So an incident with a stranger on the commute with no wider integrity issue. Private conduct with no material fit and proper consequence. Or matters that are unpleasant but trivial, implausible, or completely irrelevant. So the important bridge into the next slide is this. Private life may still matter under fit, even where COCON does not apply. I did say I wasn't going to be technical, but I'm hoping that everybody knows fit and COCON. So the next question is how firms should apply judgment and proportionality. So one thing the FCA has not done is hand firms a rigid scoring model or a checklist. It expects reasoned assessment. Personally, that is the right approach, but it does mean firms need to be able to explain their thinking clearly. It's a bit like doing a maths exam. Put your working out down, write everything down, what kind of judgments you're going to be doing, what kind of things are you going to, will require a judgment call, which way will you go, what's the assessment criteria you're going to set that underpins that. So there are 4 things on which I would focus. First is the seriousness. How serious was the conduct in context, and was it part of a wider pattern rather than just one moment looked at in isolation? Somebody could be going through a really, really hard time at home and just snaps one day at work. Is that misconduct? Probably not. But then this is where you need to get under the skin of things. Secondly, you're going to have to look at the work-related link. So did the behaviour arise in the role or in a setting where work or other representatives of the firm still mattered? Thirdly, the effect on others. So the subject's perception matters, but the firm should also ask what a reasonable person would conclude, and should not forget the effect on people witnessing this behaviour, because that's what they take away as the culture of your firm. Fourthly, consistency and evidence. Would the firm reach the same answer if the individual involved had less seniority, brought in less revenue, or had less of an influence? That's something we see quite a lot, because the action that ends up being taken depends on, well, Sunita there brings in most of our income. We can't afford to lose her. Doesn't matter if she's a bully. So you've really got to think about how you're going to apply that judgment, and apply it consistently, and apply it across the organisation, regardless of the seniority, regardless of how much revenue that individual generates, and regardless of the influence of that individual. The last question is often the most revealing. It tells you very quickly whether the framework is really being applied consistently. A big part of the judgment sits in outside of work conduct and social media. So that is another area. So this is an area where firms need to stay calm and proportionate. The right frame is material risk, not private life surveillance. So private life conduct may be relevant under FIT, where it creates a material, not remote, risk of regulatory breach if repeated at work. It may also matter where the conduct is serious enough to threaten public confidence, for example, like serious criminal conduct. And repeated minor private life conduct can become relevant if the pattern says something important about the integrity or judgment of the individual, like the example I used earlier. So the fact that conduct happened outside of work does not make it irrelevant automatically. On social media, the same principle applies. Firms should not proactively monitor people's private accounts. Lawfully expressed views are not automatically a fitness issue, but posts showing threats of violence, clear criminality, or a material risk of bullying or harassment can be relevant. So internal social media policies still matter where the post breaches firm standards. So some of you may have a social media policy, some may not. But if you haven't got one, maybe now's the time to start thinking about it. So again, the message is proportionate, judgment rather than indiscriminate monitoring. That brings us to what happens after the facts have been worked through. So what happens next? This slide is really about what should happen at the end of a case. So often firms treat closure of the HR process, that's it, clap my hands, off I go, that's the end of the matter. As I've said, it's a collaboration. Closure may be point at which the joined up regulatory questions need to be asked as well. So the sequence on this slide is helpful. You go from allegation to facts, to the COCOM view, to fit and certification, and then the references. So unproven allegations, well, they need care. They may still require escalation or even notification if they are material, but they should be treated cautiously and updated once the outcome is known. On certification and fitness, the question is whether the facts viewed fairly change the integrity or suitability assessment. And on the regulatory reference, the message is clear. Do not leave this to HR alone. The firm needs to consider whether the case would significantly affect another firm's view of the fitness and propriety of the individual. So the practical point is this. Closure is not the end of an HR case. It is the point at which the firm needs to be sure it has reached the right overall regulatory answer to. So that turns the focus onto senior managers and reasonable steps. I mentioned reasonable steps a few times, but when I talk about it, I think it helps to be clear about what the FCA is and is not asking for. Sorry, excuse me. It's not asking for perfection. It's not asking for senior managers to prevent every incident. That's impossible. We're human. We make mistakes. What it's asking for is leadership, escalation, and evidence. So in other words, could the individual explain 6 months later what they did, why they did it, and what they knew at the time? So this slide really just sets out the sort of things that usually matter, like setting clear behavioural expectations and the tone, like that tone from the top, you've all heard that. Making sure staff can raise concerns safely. Operating and improving the policies, the systems and controls. Intervening or escalating where they knew or should have known. Challenging consistency across teams, seniority and the outcomes that you're reaching. And then following through on any remediation while recording why decisions were taken. The phrase I often use is this: accountability depends on the role, knowledge and authority. It's not a strict liability regime, but it does require visible steps. And that's the only works if governance model is clear. So who is responsible? Who is accountable? What's the tone from the top? And do people trust the system? Do people trust senior managers? Do people trust your whistleblowing line? Do people trust your HR function? Those, and I make those statements quite boldly because these are some of the things that came out of our workshops that we ran through the course of 2025. So this slide here is about the operating model. And for me, this is where lots of firms either reassure themselves or expose a weakness. So the best model is clear, joined up, and capable of being evidenced. We talked about that. Someone raises a concern through their manager or through HR or through the whistleblowing line or speaking up channels. The firm then triages it properly by looking at it, safety, scope, and immediate controls. Then, if an investigation is needed, it should focus on the facts, the evidence, and a fair process. Then you get to the decision stage. This needs to be joined up enough to cover the HR outcome and the COCOM view and any fit implications and any regulatory reference consequences. And the learning needs to flow into MI, into actions, board visibility, and following that through. So the key decision choice is on the slide for a reason. Decide in advance who joins the dots across HR, compliance, legal, and the business. If you only work that out when a hard case lands, then these things are just going to go adrift. And there'll be inconsistencies. There'll be gaps in ownership. That's why I said, who is the SMF that's going to be in the driving seat for this one? You only have one driver in the car. Who's your driver? So this is exactly the sort of weakness a regulator will notice. So which brings us to what regulators tend to worry about most in this topic, by the way. So I would not present these figures as a league table. Present them as kind of more like supervisory signals. You will have all seen this. The FCA survey showed that firms are still weak in some of the most important areas. Hence, we've got the policy statement. Hence, we've got so much focus on this. Because the figures on bullying and harassment, discrimination, lack of board level MI, and absence of formal decision forums are all telling. What they suggest is not simply that misconduct exists, which we already know that it does, because if anyone says to me, well, I didn't know it existed, you're kidding yourself, because I've done keynote speaker slots this year as well. And I've had lots of people come up to me separately and give me insights into firms who think that they have fabulous cultures. What this does suggest is that a number of firms still do not have a joined up enough framework to spot things, escalate them, and then resolving the hard cases really well. Remember, don't close the door once HR have done their bit on the employment side of things. Don't forget the regulatory piece. The line on the slide that I would stress is the one about low speak up data. Often people say, yes, we do a lot of board effectiveness reviews, speak to the chair of the audit committee, and they wear that badge with honour. We don't get any. Are low numbers, are they a proof of a healthy culture or an unhealthy culture? Sometimes they reflect trust and sometimes they reflect silence, fear, or disengagement. So firms need to be careful not to read reassurance into quiet data too quickly. Have you scratched beneath the surface? And I know what people will say, we have a staff survey every year and everything's fabulous. Guess what? People will tell you what you want to hear because they don't trust the system. They don't trust the system because they feel they'll be found out. And if they're found out, they feel they'll be targeted. So therefore, your staff surveys are always going to give you a glowing report. It's your focus groups that start to tease information out on where you've got problems with culture, if there are any. I'm not suggesting that you've got problems with your culture or with non-financial misconduct, but this is what I'm talking to is the surveys that we did throughout the year of 2025. and that's what it was telling us. So the regulatory concern is often less about whether issues arise and more about whether the firm has the maturity to deal with them properly. So that becomes particularly important when the facts are disputed or not yet proven. Sorry, I'm just going to do a quick time check because obviously I'm talking for ages. I'm going to speed myself up a bit. So this is one of the most important practical slides in the deck because it's where fairness and discipline need to work together. The first point is to separate the questions. Immediate safety, employment issues, and regulatory issues are related, but they are not identical. If you collapse them all into one question too early, you can lose sight of what really needs to be decided. Secondly, use competent fact-finding and a clear record of what is known, what is disputed, and what still needs testing. And then escalate material unproven allegations when notification or a fit and proper decision may be needed. And finally, think about temporary controls or monitoring where the risk is live. And where your final answer is not yet available. On the do not side, I would emphasize 4 traps. Don't assume that no formal grievance means no issue. Don't wait for perfect certainty before asking whether conduct rules, fit or references are engaged. Don't go back and retrofit every historic case before September 2026. And do not investigate trivial, implausible or irrelevant allegations or take steps that cut across privacy or employment law. The tone here should be calm, fair and disciplined. A lot of firms know the policy, but the common pitfalls still show up in practice. So in my experience, most failures are not about policy wordings. Everyone has a fabulous policy. They're about uneven judgment and weak evidence. Remember the working out? Get your working out right, you get points for that. So the common patterns are very recognisable. Star performance being protected, different outcomes by seniority, revenue or function, low speak-up numbers, treated as reassurance, HR compliance, fit and references not being connected, no clear record of who knew what, who decided what and why, boards receiving counts but not themes, no trends, no action tracking. So the practical lesson is the one on the slide. Regulators rarely begin with, did it happen? They often begin with how the firm responded. This is why evidence matters so much. The quality of the firm's response often tells the regulator as much as the underlying incident itself. So if firms want to improve quickly, this is a slide to work through honestly. The good news is that what good looks like is quite practical. Good does not have to mean heavy, does not require a huge framework or a new department. As I've said many times throughout this presentation, it's clear, fair, proportionate, and yes, evidence. There are 5 practical steps on the slide, and they are the right ones. Refresh policies and your case taxonomy, so the language, scope, and escalation triggers are all clear. Join up case handling so people know who assesses the HR outcome, the conduct rules, the fit, the certification, notifications, and references. And then train your managers and investigators so they are confident on the work-related link, the private life boundary, the evidence, the documentation. Strengthen your MI so boards get more than raw case counts, and then test consistency through hard scenarios, particularly asking whether outcomes would shift depending on seniority or commercial value. Bet they would. This is why I say firms should use the period before September 2026 really sensibly. Review your policies, conduct breach reporting, fit and proper assessments, and regulatory references now, while there's still time to improve these things. So for MGAA firms, there are a few practical features that make this especially important. First, small teams and dual hats. In many MGAA firms, the same person may be the line manager, the revenue generator, the founder, and also the informal decision maker. That makes clarity of escalation more important, not less. Secondly, market events and travel. The line between the office, client entertainment, conferences and social settings can be really blurred in smaller firms. So firms need a confident view on the work-related link. Thirdly, contractors, secondees and partners. Firms need to think beyond employees because consultants, secondees and delegated relationships, because let's face it, when you're first setting up, you outsource quite a lot. So these relationships can still create behaviour, governance and oversight issues. And finally, concentrated risk. If the individual involved is a senior rainmaker, founder or business leader, uneven tolerance becomes a culture and governance signal very, very quickly. So the key message for you today is that smaller organisations do not get an easier pass. In some ways, the need for consistency is even sharper because those lines are so blurred. I like ending the substance with some scenarios because they show very quickly whether a framework really works. So the first scenario is your rainmaker. A senior underwriter delivers strong results, but there are repeated complaints about comments at market functions, even though no formal grievance has ever been made. So the real question here is not whether someone has yet filed the perfect complaint. The question is, who needs to know in the first 48 hours what evidence is needed now and whether there is already a conduct, fit and proper or reference issue in play? You got the second scenario, is the silent team. Performance is good, turnover is low, but exits and pulse feedback suggest people do not challenge leadership. Here the risk is false comfort. Is the absence of noise really a sign of health? Or a sign that your speak up routes are not trusted? And you got the third scenario, is outside of work. Certified employee is arrested for serious assault with no direct client angle. The questions are what is known versus alleged, whether this triggers a fit and proper reassessment, and whether temporary controls, certification or notification questions are engaged. The line I would land strongly is the last one on the slide. If the answer depends on who the individual is rather than what the facts are, your framework's not ready. So let me close it back by bringing you back into the key takeaways. First, how the FCA defines and approaches non-financial misconduct under the conduct rules and the fitness and propriety framework. Second was the non-financial misconduct may fall within senior managers and certification regime, including conduct outside of work or on social media. Thirdly, the governance, escalation and decision-making expectations placed on firms, senior managers and boards. And finally, the practical steps firms should take to manage this risk in a way that is consistent, proportionate and defensible. So my closing message is, the hardest part of this topic is not spotting the obvious cases. It's making calm, fair, joined up decisions when the facts are incomplete. The personalities are influential and the boundaries are not neat. That is where judgment, governance and evidence really do matter. So on that note, I'm going to see if anyone's got any questions. And whilst we've got questions, I'm going to leave this slide up so that really appreciate people's feedback. There's a QR code. Please do, if there's anything today that raises some questions you don't want to discuss here in a public forum, then please do drop me an email, connect on LinkedIn. We're here to help you, because if some of you on the call know me, you'll know that I'm very passionate about this topic. So we want to make sure our market is as credible as the banking sector. So thanks again for your time today, and I'm here to take any questions or do you want your lunch, because it's 13 minutes to go?
Thank you, Sunita. I've enabled mics and cameras if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question directly, but chat and Q&A are also available to anyone who wants to type instead, if they don't feel comfortable verbally asking. Just feel free to submit your questions to us, please.
Anybody?
Might have a quiet bunch, or the promise of lunch. Oh, here we go. We've had a question come through. Let me just go back to the chat from Naveed, asking how the FCA are going to monitor if the firms are doing this rightly. Do firms have to submit MI?
Good question. No, firms will not have to submit. There's no reporting on this just yet. But the way that the regulators will start to find out how firms have implemented this and are embedding this is through your board packs, through your governance packs. And let's take ourselves the pattern that the regulator is forming over the last few years. It's like we've got this big piece of regulation, like consumer duty, for example. Here you go, guys, go away and do it. Do your board attestations. We don't need it. But guess what? They did ask for a few, didn't they? They asked for them. They did a thematic review, and then they are still sending out updates on that. So it's about being outcome focused. It's about making sure, remember the pyramid, information from the bottom going all the way to the top. Remember the themes, remember the root cause analysis, the reporting being more than just about the numbers. So it's about having almost like a culture dashboard where non-financial misconduct forms part of it, that ends up with the board and the board asking the right questions. So when you do get asked, you said, that came out, we did this, here's what we did. And then, is it working in practice? They might start asking firms for, have you seen an increase in whistleblowing reports? Have you seen, the whistleblowing channel is just one mechanism of how firms can implement. We have first aiders, we have people who show you where you need to go when there's a fire in the building. Why can't you have trusted colleagues at different levels where people can just go up to them and say, look, I'm experiencing something. I don't want to go down the formal channel. There's lots of ways that you can start gathering information and data and start forming some trust in organisations. So the answer to the question is no formal report, but there could be a call for information from you at any point post-implementation.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Sunita. And actually, whilst you've been answering that question, a couple more have come through. I'm going to start from next in line from Michael, who asks if social media could matter in a case with NFM, but firms are not supposed to monitor social media. What steps are appropriate in identifying NFM on social media? Your thoughts?
Right, so I think these are just my thoughts, but like I said, it's not for firms to go and kind of like go through and scour through all the employee social media sites. It will be something that gets alerted, something that gets tagged. People talk. Social media is like things on there move very, very quickly. But if something then does get raised and it's brought to someone's attention, I don't know if your firm has a social media policy. So there should be some do's and don'ts in social media policies of what you can report, what you do on your personal life, what you do in your professional. But remember the two buckets. You got the fit and you got the COCON. So one might not be a breach of COCON rules, but it could question your integrity in terms of if you're doing stuff on social media. And often we know there's all this legislation coming in about stopping kids under the age of 16 having social media access. Why? Because it's rife with bullying, and people get bullied, and that has very serious consequences for both the individual and the kind of people who follow some of these people. So I think it's got to be something really serious from a social media perspective that raises its head above the parapet, and people will talk, and that then you have an obligation to go and investigate it once something is brought to your attention. So remember, sometimes things are just going to come up. Don't ignore it, investigate it. If you've got a social media policy, reinforce that. But that's my view.
Fantastic, thank you. Please do let us know if there's any follow-up. Obviously, Michael and Naveed, to anything Sunita's mentioned there, but I'm going to move on to the next one from Richard, who asks, how would you recommend ensuring a fair assessment of behaviour in a firm whose corporate culture might be dominated by one individual or a very small group of people?
That's a very, very good question. And that is where you've got a real challenge. So let's say you've joined a small firm and 4 buddies have pulled it together. It can be quite, thinking it's quite funny. I'm somebody who grew up in the 70s, and what was acceptable then is definitely not acceptable now. But it's people still have a mindset that, oh, I was only banter, I was only joking, and they can put everything into a banter and a joke bucket, but that's not acceptable, because if it's crossing that line and those boundaries of harassment or bullying. But so where do you go? Because you want to make a whistleblowing report, or you want to call out the behaviours. So it depends the severity of it. So there are external organisations. I can dig out the links because I think we did it when we did one of these sessions for LIBA. For smaller firms, there are links to external organisations where you can make notifications. Also, there is the FCA. So it depends, how do you want to raise the issue? Do you want to raise an issue that you want to, you want to leave, you want to walk away, but you can't let people get away with their behaviour? If you've got a Lloyd's connection, there is also the Lloyd's whistleblowing line as well. But there are different ways that you can approach this. So if you want to contact me separately, I'm more than happy to go into the detail of that.
Fantastic, thank you. And just a reminder that Sunita's details are on the slide there. The last question that's come through is from Melanie, who asks, with decisions left to judgment calls, COCON, does this run the risk of discrepancies between firms, and some perhaps being harsher than others? And are there any controls in place for this?
No, so you've got the black and white piece, rules say X. So and everyone's going to be reaching, so the starting point and the end point are going to be the same for all firms. So you've got the rules as your starting point and you've got the outcomes as the end point. But in between there, as we've seen some of the grey areas, I would document where your judgment is going to come in play. So even though it's judgment, it's almost like you've documented which way you're going to go. And I'm not going to say that you're going to capture every single possible situation, but you can start with some of the examples that I've set out in this presentation today, because they're the more obvious ones, where somebody's more junior or somebody's more senior. So having a documented approach, having the appropriate training for people at all different levels, having playbooks for people, you start to drive some consistency. I think before we get to a level ground across our market, this is going to go up and down a bit more. And I reckon, after the 1st of September, this is not the last we've heard on this topic from the regulator. I reckon they're going to start asking, do you remember when they did their first survey, they asked for a whole load of data points from firms, like compromise agreements, how many people have left and what kind of things were logged. They asked for loads of information. I don't know, will they retest some of those things again and ask for the numbers around those again? If there hasn't been a shift in the dial and actually nothing's really changed, will they do something a little bit more severe? I don't know, if I'm honest. That's helpful, isn't it?
Thank you for that, and hopefully that's answered all the questions that have been put. I can't see any follow-up. Just a thank you, actually. So thanks for the answers you've given to questions. I haven't had any more questions come in, so I think actually that in terms of timing, perfect timing, and we'll look to wrap up. I just want to thank our members for coming along to this session, but most importantly, thanks Sunita for her insight and time in delivering this session for our other members. As always, we value your feedback. Just dropped a quick link to our survey, and we'll get this recording out to everyone shortly. But no, thank you all again for your time. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of day.
Thank you.